Imagine waking up to discover your wife lifeless in her locked bedroom, her face eerily calm. No signs of violence, just empty lungs and faint. Symmetrical bruising around her chest as if crushed by an invisible force. But this wasn't a one-off nightmare. It struck 14 times across the wealthiest estates in one isolated Virginia county, leaving coroners baffled and families desperate to bury the truth. What if the killer wasn't a stranger, but someone invited into the most intimate spaces, turning desire into death? Tonight, we dive into the macabre mystery of the Virginia breath stealer tale so dark that the elite burned their own records to hide it. Buckle up, this story will leave you breathless. The fall of 1835 in Fairfax County, Virginia, arrived not with the promise of renewal, but with a suffocating humidity that seemed to press the very breath from the lungs of the living. It was a season described in local agricultural journals as miasmatic, where the scent of blooming magnolia was so thick it bordered on the nauseating sweetness of decay. In this secluded enclave of the Golden Crescent, wealth flowed as freely as the tidal rivers, building white-columned monuments to a civilization resting atop a foundation of human chattel. The plantations here were islands of absolute power, isolated by miles of swamp and moss-draped oak, creating private kingdoms where the master's word was law, and the mistress's desire was a command that could not be refused. Into this atmosphere of oppressive heat and moral stagnation arrived Dr. Elias Hawthorne, a physician and coroner trained in the sterile, cold lecture halls of Boston. He was summoned to investigate a peculiar cluster of inexplicable deaths that had begun to plague the matriarchs of the district. Hawthorne's private journals, preserved in the archives of the Virginia Medical Society, record his initial impressions of the region with a mixture of scientific curiosity and visceral unease. He notes the peculiar stillness that seemed to hang over the plantation houses, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a breath held in anticipation of violence. The doctor describes the architecture of the area as deceptive. The wide verandas and open windows were designed to catch the breeze. Yet the interiors of the private quarters were often stifling, heavy with velvet draperies and the unspoken secrets of the families who inhabited them. Hawthorne was a man of empirical fact, a believer in the tangible and the observable. Yet his early entries betray a growing sense that the air in Fairfax County carried a weight that could not be measured by any barometer. He wrote of a localized hysteria, a nervousness that manifested in the way the plantation owners gripped their riding crops and the way their wives grew pale at the onset of twilight. The social hierarchy of the county was rigid, a porcelain structure of manners and appearances that concealed a rotting interior. The women who would soon become the subjects of Hawthorne's autopsies were the jewels of this society, women in their late 20s and 30s, celebrated for their grace, their needlepoint, and their piety. They were the moral centers of their households, publicly adored by husbands who spent their days in the fields and their nights in the study. Yet Hawthorne's observations, initially clinical, began to pick up on the subtle fractures in this facade. He noted the erratic behavior of the enslaved domestic staff, who moved with a terrified efficiency, their eyes fixed on the floor as if navigating a minefield invisible to the naked eye. There were whispers in the markets of a shadow that moved between the estate's presence that was welcomed through the back doors, even as the front doors were bolted against the night. The medical infrastructure of the time was ill-equipped to deal with the phenomenon that was unfolding. Apoplexy and congestion of the brain were catch-all terms used to explain sudden deaths that lacked obvious external causes, providing a veil of medical legitimacy to events that defied explanation. Hawthorne, however, was a meticulous pathologist who brought with him the latest advancements in forensic science tools that would soon put him at odds with the established order of the county. He did not accept the vague pronouncements of the local country doctors, who seemed more interested in preserving the dignity of the deceased than in uncovering the cause of death. To Hawthorne, a body was a document to be read, and the story these bodies were telling was one of impossible contradiction. Central to the economy and the tragedy of Fairfax County was the system of human ownership that reduced men and women to lines in a ledger. It was a world where a human being's value was calculated in muscle mass, breeding potential, and obedience. Among the thousands of enslaved souls in the county, the records show the repeated transfer of a specific individual, a man whose physical description in the sales contracts stands out for its detail. He is listed as Elijah, aged roughly 26, described as having a noble bearing and exceptional physical symmetry. Unlike most field hands whose transfers were purely utilitarian, Elijah's movements tracked perfectly with the trajectory of the deaths Hawthorne was investigating. Ko was a domestic servant, a houseman whose duties brought him into the intimate sphere of the plantation mistresses. Proximity that in any other context would be strictly regulated, but here seemed to be encouraged. The atmosphere inside the big houses was one of claustrophobic intimacy. Hawthorne observed that despite the vast acreage of the plantations, the lives of the women were confined to a few rooms: the parlor, the dining room, and the boudoir. These spaces became pressure cookers of boredom, isolation, and unchecked authority. The power dynamic was absolute. A mistress could command any service, demand any presence, and inflict any punishment without recourse. It was in this vacuum of accountability that the tragedy began to take root. The heat of the Virginia fall seemed to exacerbate the tensions, stripping away the polite veneer of society to reveal the raw, ugly impulses beneath. Hawthorne wrote of a fever of the spirit that seemed to infect the wives, a restlessness that led them to stay awake long into the night, pacing their rooms as if waiting for a visitor who had no business being there. The environment itself seemed complicit in the unfolding horror. The swamps that bordered the estates were ancient and impenetrable, home to creatures that thrived in the dark and the wet. The nights were loud with the chorus of frogs and insects, a wall of sound that could mask a gasp, a cry, or the desperate intake of breath. Hawthorne found himself unable to sleep, disturbed by the thick, wet air that felt like a physical intrusion. He began to suspect that the miasma blamed for the deaths was not rising from the swamps, but was being generated within the houses themselves, toxic accumulation of secrets that had finally reached a critical mass. The isolation of each estate meant that a scream could go unheard, and a death could be arranged and discovered before the outside world ever knew a crisis was occurring. In this world of stark contrasts between the brutalized field hands and the pampered aristocracy, between the blinding sun and the shadowed boudoir, the stage was set for a sequence of events that science explains only with great difficulty. The narrative that Hawthorne would piece together was not one of a random epidemic, but of a calculated serial elimination. It was a story that challenged the fundamental assumptions of the society he was observing. The belief that the enslaved were powerless, that the masters were untouchable, and that the walls of the plantation house were a fortress against the consequences of one's own actions. The silent breath, as the locals would later call it, was about to claim its first documented victim, and with her, the illusion of safety would shatter. Dr. Hawthorne's arrival went largely unnoticed by the social elite, who viewed him as merely another functionary of the state. They could not know that his notebook would become the only repository for the truth of their demise. As the humidity rose and the magnolia blossoms opened their waxy white petals, the first tragedy struck the Harrington estate. It was a death that would be mourned publicly with great fanfare, but privately it marked the beginning of a terror that would grip the county for months. The machinery of death had been set in motion, silent and efficient, fueled by the very desires the society sought to repress. The death of Amelia Harrington on the morning of October 17, 1835, stands as the first incontrovertible entry in Dr. Elias Hawthorne's investigation. At 28 years of age, Mrs. Harrington was the picture of vitality, a woman known for her spirited riding and her robust constitution, making her sudden demise all the more baffling to the local community. The official report filed by the family physician, a man of old habits and older prejudices, listed the cause of death as nocturnal apoplexy, citing the unseasonable heat as a contributing factor. However, when Dr. Hawthorne was granted access to the body, under the pretext of a county-mandated survey on regional fevers. What he found on the cooling slab of the undertaker's parlor contradicted every norm of natural death. Amelia Harrington did not look like a woman who had succumbed to a stroke or a fit. She looked like a statue carved from marble, her features locked in a mask of eerie, serene stillness. Hawthorne's private autopsy notes, written in a cramped, hurried hand, detail anomalies that the official record conveniently omitted. He observed that while the skin was pale and bloodless, there was a distinctive symmetrical discoloration. Along the ribcage, faint violet bruises that did not correspond to a fall or a strike. These marks wrapped around the torso, suggesting a pressure that was immense, uniform, and sustained. It is as if, Hawthorne wrote, she was embraced by a band of iron that simply refused to let go. The pressure had been applied with such terrifying control that it had not broken the ribs, but had compressed the lungs completely, forcing every cubic inch of air from the body without leaving the chaotic trauma associated with a violent struggle. The room in which she died offered no clues to a struggle, further deepening the mystery. The bed linens were largely undisturbed. The pillows were not scattered, and there was no sign of an intruder having forced entry. The windows were latched from the inside, and the heavy oak door had been locked, requiring her husband, Captain Theodore Harrington, to break the paneling to reach her when she failed to appear for breakfast. This locked room scenario baffled the local authorities, who could only conclude that the killer, if there was one, was a phantom or that the ailment was indeed internal. But Hawthorne's medical eye saw the bruising and knew that no disease grips a body from the outside in with the precision of a vice. What disturbed Hawthorne most, however, was the expression on the deceased's face. In cases of strangulation or suffocation, the victim's visage is typically contorted in terror and agony, the eyes bulging, the mouth agape in a final scream for air. Amelia Harrington's face was smooth, her eyes wide open but fixed on a point above her with a look that Hawthorne could only describe as transfixed. It was not the face of a woman fighting for her life. It was the face of a woman who had been watching her death approach and had, for reasons impossible to fathom, remained paralyzed until the darkness took her. The physiological evidence suggested a sudden, massive restriction of breath. Yet the psychological evidence printed on her features suggested a terrifying compliance. During the examination, Hawthorne made a discovery that would haunt the remainder of his investigation. Clenched tightly in Mrs. Harrington's right hand, hidden beneath the folds of the burial shroud where the family had not thought to look, was a small object. It was a crude carving of a mockingbird whittled from dark swamp cypress. The wood was smooth, polished by the friction of a thumb rubbing against it repeatedly, suggesting it was a token of immense sentimental value or fixation. It was a primitive object, utterly out of place among the imported silks and fine jewelry of a plantation mistresses, tangible link to a world she should have had no part in. Hawthorne pocketed the object, omitting it from the official inventory, sensing it was the key to the anomaly. The reaction of Captain Harrington was one of bewildered grief mixed with a defensive hostility. When Hawthorne questioned him about the bruises, the captain became enraged, accusing the doctor of desecrating his wife's memory with ghoulish insinuations. He insisted that his wife was a saint, a woman of unimpeachable virtue who spent her evenings in prayer and reading. Yet Hawthorne noted the husband's refusal to look at the bruises, himself a denial that seemed rooted in a subconscious fear of what they represented. The captain mentioned, almost in passing, that the house had been unusually quiet that night, that even the dogs had not barked, a detail that struck Hawthorne as significant in a region where watchdogs were trained to attack any shadow that moved. In the days following the funeral, Hawthorne interviewed the household staff, whose terrified silence was a stark contrast to the master's bluster. It was from a scullery maid that Hawthorne first heard the name Elijah. The girl spoke it in a whisper, her eyes darting to the overseer standing in the yard. She mentioned that Elijah had been the one to bring the evening tea to the mistress's quarters, a task usually reserved for the female house slaves. When Hawthorne checked the plantation's inventory to speak with this man, he found another anomaly. Elijah was gone. He had been sold the very morning Amelia Harrington's body was discovered, transferred to the neighboring Montgomery estate with a haste that suggested a frantic desire to purge the house of his presence. The transfer documents listed the reason for sale as reorganization of a setza bureaucratic, euphemism that made no sense for a slave of such high value. Why sell a prime domestic servant for a fraction of his worth mere hours after a tragedy? Hawthorne began to suspect that the captain's haste was not about reorganization, but about removal. The link between the man, Elijah, and the death of Amelia Harrington was circumstantial, a mere coincidence of timing. Yet the physical evidence on the body spoke of a human agency, a strength that was controlled, deliberate, and intimately close. The carving found in her hand was the physical bridge between the mistress of the house and the world of the enslaved, a bridge that should not have existed. As Hawthorne closed the file on Amelia Harrington, he wrote a final observation that would serve as the thesis for the horror to come. The pathology of this death is not medical, but social. The pressure that stopped her heart came from a source she knew, a source she permitted into her sanctuary. She was not murdered by an intruder. She was silenced by a guest. The anomaly of the bruising, the peaceful face, the locked door, and the missing servant formed a pattern that was about to repeat itself, challenging the very laws of science and society. The inventory of breath had begun, and the first entry was written in the ink of silence. The weeks following Amelia Harrington's funeral did not bring the expected return to normality. Instead, they heralded a cascade of tragedies that defied statistical probability. By mid-November, 2 more death certificates crossed Dr. Hawthorne's desk, both from estates bordering the Harrington plantation. The victims were women of similar standing: Mrs. Beatrice Montgomery, aged 32, and Mrs. Carolyn Sinclair, aged 29. In both cases, the cause of death was listed with the same vague terminology: respiratory failure and sudden seizures. Hawthorne, driven by the nagging memory of the cypress bird and the phantom bruising, maneuvered his way into the parlors of the grieving families, finding patterns that transformed coincidence into a terrifying design. The physical evidence on these subsequent victims mirrored the first case with impossible precision. Mrs. Montgomery was found in her chaise lounge, a book of poetry open on her lap, her body rigid in a posture of repose. Upon closer inspection, Hawthorne found the same telltale violet bands wrapping around her torso, the imprint of a crushing embrace that had squeezed the life from her without disarranging her lace collar. Mrs. Sinclair was discovered in her bed, the canopy curtains drawn tight. Her bruising was more pronounced, darkening the skin beneath her nightdress. Yet her face bore that same eerie expression of transfixed calm, as if she had been lulled into death rather than forced. The absence of defensive wounds, no scratches, no torn fingernails screamed of a compliance that unnerved the doctor to his core. Hawthorne turned his attention from the bodies to the bureaucratic machinery of the county, diving into the ledger books that recorded the movement of human property. What he found was a trail of transfers that blazed like a signal fire across the map of Fairfax County. The enslaved man, Elijah, appeared in the records of the Montgomery estate 3 weeks before Beatrice's death, purchased from the Harrington estate. 2 days after Mrs. Montgomery's funeral, the record showed Elijah was sold again, this time to the Sinclair plantation. The pattern was absolute: arrival, a brief period of service, the death of the mistress, and an immediate, unexplained sale. He was being passed like a token of bad luck, or perhaps like a weapon whose trigger had been pulled. The descriptions of Elijah in the overseer's logbooks and private letters offered a jarring contrast to the carnage left in his wake. He was never described as violent, rebellious, or difficult. On the contrary, the records were filled with unsettling praise. A letter from Mrs. Montgomery to her sister in Richmond, dated a week before her death, read, "The new houseman Elijah is a marvel of quiet dignity. He moves through the house like a shadow, anticipating needs before I speak them. He has the strength of a field hand, but the hands of a pianist. I find myself quite flustered by his attentiveness. These documents painted a portrait of a man who was exceptionally skilled at navigating the emotional landscapes of his own man who used his desirable bearing to disarm the very people who claimed to own him. Hawthorne began to collect gossip from the periphery of these households, fragments of overheard conversations and rumors from the slave quarters. The picture that emerged was one of a silent seduction. It was whispered that the mistresses were not merely being served by Elijah. They were captivated by him. In a society where white women were placed on pedestals of untouchable purity, the presence of this exceptionally handsome man in their private boudoir created a tension that was both forbidden and intoxicating. The anomalous evidence suggested that Elijah was not breaking into these rooms. He was being invited in, likely under the guise of extra duties or personal service, exploiting the dangerous curiosity of women bored by their gilded cages. The recurring motif of the transfer became the most damning piece of evidence. In each case, the sale of Elijah was handled not by the grieving husband directly, but through intermediaries, often for prices far below his market value. It was as if the families wanted to rid themselves of him instantly, without questions, treating him as distressed property. Hawthorne hypothesized that the husbands suspected something, not necessarily murder, but perhaps an infidelity or an impropriety that shamed them into silence. By selling him on, they were washing their hands of the stain, unknowingly passing the executioner to the next neighbor. Among the anomalies was the complete lack of noise reported on the nights of the deaths. Servants sleeping in adjacent rooms, light sleepers' dogs. None reported a sound. This silence reinforced the theory of the soporific presence. Elijah appeared to possess an ability to lower the defenses of the house, creating a bubble of quiet in which he operated. Hawthorne found a diary entry from a governess at the Sinclair estate that noted, "When he is in the room, the air feels heavier, sleepier. Even the children stop their fussing. It is a strange, heavy calm." This heavy calm was the precursor to the suffocation, a weaponization of atmosphere itself. Hawthorne also noted the absence of theft. In all three cases, jewelry, money, and silver were left untouched in the very rooms where the women died. This was not a crime of profit. The motive was obscure, buried under layers of racial and gender dynamics that Hawthorne was struggling to decode. The killer took only the breath of the victim, leaving everything else of value behind. This specificity pointed to a crime of passion, or perhaps a crime of ritual retribution, exacted against a specific class of victim for a specific unspoken transgression. As the third body was laid to rest and the transfer papers for Elijah were signed yet again, this time sending him to the sprawling Beaumont plantation, Hawthorne realized he was observing a serial phenomenon that the law had no language for. The accumulation of evidence, the bruised torsos, the serene faces, the transfer logs, the letters of infatuation, the unnatural silence pointed to a conclusion that terrified him. The weapon was not a poison or a blade. It was the man himself. And the society that had created him, that viewed him as a mindless object of labor and desire, had handed him the perfect camouflage for his revenge. The anomaly was not just the deaths. It was the blindness of a civilization that could not conceive of the furniture fighting back. Armed with the autopsies and the transfer logs, Dr. Hawthorne retreated to his study to formulate a hypothesis that could explain the impossible. He turned to the pile of correspondence he had managed to secure, letters written by the victims recovered from trash fires or sympathetic relatives. Among them was a partially burned letter from Carolyn Sinclair, the latest victim, addressed to a cousin in Alexandria. The handwriting was feverish, the ink blotted, capturing a mind in the grip of an obsession. "He is not like the others," she wrote. "When he looks at me, I feel as though I am transparent. He does not lower his eyes as he should. He waits. He stands by the door and simply waits. And I find myself inventing tasks to keep him there. It is a sin, I know, but his strength, it is a palpable thing vibrating in the air." From these sources, Hawthorne constructed his first working theory, the theory of the fatal seducer. He hypothesized that Elijah was not merely a passive servant. but an active predator who had learned to weaponize the illicit desires of the plantation mistresses. Hawthorne reasoned that Elijah, aware of his own physical appeal and the moral rot at the heart of the aristocracy, was engaging in a high-stakes game of psychological entrapment. He was not forcing his way into the boudoirs. He was luring the women into compromising positions where their own guilt would paralyze them. The transfixed expressions on the dead faces were not just peace. They were the shock of realization the moment the object of desire revealed himself as the angel of death. Hawthorne's notes from this period reflect a struggle to reconcile his medical training with the psychological darkness he was uncovering. The predator does not hunt. He scribbled in the margins of a medical text. He waits to be invited in. He presents himself as a vessel for their fantasies, the strong, silent, obedient lover. And once they have admitted him into their most private sanctuary, he inverts the dynamic. Hawthorne speculated that the suffocation was the ultimate symbolic act, silencing the women who had doubtedly commanded him, silenced him, and objectified him. By taking their breath, he was reclaiming the agency they had tried to strip from him. The hypothesis gained weight when Hawthorne examined the timing of the deaths relative to the husband's absences. In every case, the master of the house had been away on hunting trips, business in Richmond, or political meetings in Washington. Elijah knew the schedules. He knew the rhythms of the house. Hawthorne theorized that the soporific effect described by the governess was a calculated performance of extreme submissiveness designed to disarm fear. By projecting an aura of total safety and compliance, Elijah tricked the women into lowering their guard both physically and morally. They believed they were in control of the encounter right up until the moment his arms closed around them. Hawthorne also considered the physiological aspect of the killings. He hypothesized that Elijah was using a specific technically learned or practiced to compress the thoracic cage without breaking bone. The mechanics of the embrace, Hawthorne wrote, suggest a knowledge of anatomy or a history of physical labor that utilizes compression. He recalled the maid's mention of Elijah working with horses, perhaps subduing animals with his legs or body weight. This transferred skill, the ability to hold a living thing immobile until it ceased to struggle, was being applied to humans. It was a terrifying efficiency that spoke of practice or, perhaps, a terrifying natural aptitude. However, a flaw remained in Hawthorne's theory. If this were purely a crime of lust or opportunistic violence, why the ritualistic consistency? Why leave the bodies so pristine? Hawthorne began to suspect a deeper motive, one rooted in a specific grievance. He revisited the sales records and noticed a detail he had previously overlooked. In every household Elijah entered, there was a record of harsh disciplinary action against other slaves in the weeks preceding the mistress's death. Cook whipped. A stable boy sold, a seamstress punished. Was Elijah acting as a vigilante? The seduction merely the means to access the person responsible for the cruelty, the mistress who whispered the orders to the husband? This avenging angel variant of his hypothesis posited that Elijah viewed himself as an instrument of justice in a land without law. The women, often protected by the illusion of their gender's fragility, were frequently the instigators of domestic cruelty, their boredom manifesting in petty tyrannies. Hawthorne wondered if the seduction was a test. The women had rejected him, had maintained their moral station. Would they have survived? Or was their fall inevitable the moment he crossed the threshold? The letter from Mrs. Sinclair suggested she felt tempted, implying a choice. She chose to keep him in the room. She chose to engage, and for that choice, she paid with her life. Hawthorne's hypothesis was radical for 1835. It suggested that an enslaved man possessed the intellectual and psychological complexity to dismantle his oppressors from the inside out. It challenged the racist pseudoscience of the day that claimed African minds were incapable of long-term planning or complex emotional vendettas. Hawthorne was forcing himself to see Elijah not as a brute or a savage, as a brilliant sociopathic tactician who had identified the fatal weakness of the Southern aristocracy. Their arrogance. They believed they could play with fire without getting burned because they believed the fire had no will of its own. As Hawthorne prepared to test his theory, news arrived that Elijah had been settled at the Beaumont estate for nearly a month. The clock was ticking. If the pattern held, Victoria Beaumont, a woman known for her vanity and her cruel temper, was already in the final stages of the trap. Hawthorne's hypothesis was no longer just an academic exercise. It was a prediction of the next murder. He had to prove that the feminine weakness filling the graveyards was, in fact, the calculated retribution of a man who had decided that if he could not be free, he would at least be the master of death. By the winter of 1835, the silent breath had moved from the realm of private tragedy to public hysteria. The accumulated deaths could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, and the social fabric of Fairfax County began to tear under the strain of paranoia. Dr. Hawthorne's journals record a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the district. The Sunday church services, once occasions for displaying fine bonnets and carriages, became somber assemblies where neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The sermons grew darker, focusing on sins of the flesh and divine judgment, creating a feedback loop of guilt and fear that permeated the community. The planters' men who prided themselves on their absolute control found themselves powerless against an enemy they could not name and refused to acknowledge openly. The documents from this period capture the fracturing of households. Diaries of plantation owners reveal that husbands began sleeping with loaded pistols on their nightstands, not to protect against intruders from the outside, but against the vague dread within. Overseers, sensing the tension, increased their brutality, whipping enslaved workers for insolence or merely for looking too long at the main house. This reactionary violence only heightened the atmosphere of terror. A letter from a local magistrate to the governor describes the county as a powder keg, warning that the women are fainting at shadows and the men are striking out at ghosts. There is a poison in the well, it reads, and we cannot find the source. It was during this period of disintegration that Hawthorne managed to secure the testimony of Lydia, a young enslaved maid from the Montgomery estate who had been sold to a town merchant after her mistress's death. Her account, transcribed by Hawthorne in the back of a medical ledger, provides the most chilling insight into the physical reality of the threat. Lydia spoke with a trembling voice, refusing to say Elijah's name, referring to him only as him or the Iron One. She described seeing him in the stables before he was brought into the house. He broke the horses, not with the whip, Lydia whispered. He used his legs. He would wrap his legs around the colt's neck and squeeze. Just squeeze until the beast went still and the eyes rolled back. He called it quieting. He said, "Anything can be quieted if you hold it tight enough." This testimony, the legs of iron, bridged the gap between the animal and the human, the stable and the boudoir. It confirmed Hawthorne's suspicion about the mechanics of the deaths. The soporific charm was the lure, but the execution was an act of terrifying physical domination, mimicking the breaking of a wild animal. Lydia also revealed the dynamic inside the house. The mistress, she would watch him from the window. She would call him to move heavy things that didn't need moving. She liked to see him sweat. She thought she was playing with him like a cat with a mouse. But she didn't see that he was the cat. The social fracture deepened as rumors of the slave who silenced the ladies began to circulate in the slave quarters. Unlike the white community, which was paralyzed by confusion, the enslaved population seemed to understand exactly what was happening. Hawthorne noted a subtle shift in their demeanor, a quiet defiance, a shared secret. The Iron Lover was becoming a folk hero, a mythic figure who turned the master's tools against them. This terrified the white population even more. They sensed they were being laughed at, judged, and condemned by the very people they claimed to own. The fear of a general uprising, always the nightmare of the South, began to merge with the specific fear of the silent killer. In the parlors, the women whispered of abolitionist poison or voodoo curses, desperate to find an external cause for the deaths. To admit that a slave could seduce and kill them was to admit a failure of their own moral and racial superiority. They clung to the idea of illness or magic because the truth that they were complicit in their own destruction was too shattering to bear. Hawthorne recorded a conversation with a prominent matron who insisted, "It must be the water, or perhaps a miasma from the swamp. It cannot be him. He is too beautiful to be a monster." This cognitive dissonance, this refusal to see the danger behind the beauty, was the fracture that Elijah exploited time and again. The authorities, paralyzed by fear of scandal, refused to conduct a formal investigation into Elijah. To arrest him and put him on trial would require public testimony about where he was and what he was doing when the women died. It would air the dirty laundry of the Golden Crescent for all to see. So they chose the path of silence and transfer, hoping the problem would disappear if they just moved it far enough away. This cowardice, documented in the minutes of the town council, allowed the killing spree to continue. They prioritized their reputation over the lives of their wives, a moral failing that Hawthorne noted with bitter irony. As the chill of winter intensified, the Beaumont estate became the focal point of the gathering storm. Victoria Beaumont, the current mistress of Elijah, was a woman of immense vanity and social ambition. The gossip letters described her parading Elijah around the estate like a prize stallion, oblivious to the history that trailed him. Hawthorne tried to intervene, sending a guarded note to Mr. Beaumont, suggesting that the new servant might carry a contagion. The note was ignored. The fracture in the society had become a chasm. They were so blinded by their own power that they could not see the knife at their throats even when the doctor pointed directly at it. The record of this social fracture is a testament to the power of denial. An entire community watched a pattern of death unfold and refused to name it, paralyzed by the fear that naming it would destroy their worldview. They chose to live in terror rather than face the truth. And in that gap between reality and delusion, Elijah operated with impunity, silent judge carrying out a sentence that the society had passed on itself. The turning point in Dr. Hawthorne's investigation, and the moment the horror shifted from hypothesis to absolute certainty, came with the discovery of Victoria Beaumont's personal diary following her death in late December 1835, which occurred under identical circumstances to the previous victims. The Beaumont household collapsed into chaos. In the confusion, a distraught housemaid fearing she would be blamed for the mistress's apoplexis told the diary from the bedside table and brought it to the doctor, hoping he could find proof of her innocence. What Hawthorne found in those leather-bound pages was not just proof of innocence, but a confession of guilt so profound it indicted the entire plantation class. Victoria's diary was a window into the soul of a predator who believed herself to be a benevolent queen. Her entries detailed with shocking candor her obsession with Elijah. She did not describe a romance, she described a possession. "He is the finest specimen I have ever seen," she wrote on November 12th. "I have ordered him to attend to my bath. He keeps his eyes down, but I can feel him burning. I will make him look at me. I own him, and I will have all of him." The writing revealed a woman who viewed Elijah's body as a toy provided for her amusement and diversion from the boredom of her station. She documented her threats. "I told him if he did not please me, I would have his brother sent to the cane fields in Louisiana. He became very compliant after that. He is mine." The diary entries escalated in intensity, describing encounters that Victoria framed as seductions, but which Hawthorne recognized as coercion. She reveled in her power, interpreting Elijah's silence as awe and his stillness as submission. But buried in her own words were the signs of the trap closing. "He holds me with such strength," she wrote 3 days before her death. "It is frightening, yet thrilling. He does not speak. He only holds tighter, tighter, until the world goes gray, and I feel I am floating. He controls my breath, and I let him." She was describing the rehearsal of her own murder, interpreting the constricting grip of the executioner as the embrace of a lover. This document shattered Hawthorne's earlier seducer theory. Elijah was not seducing them in the traditional sense. He was allowing them to force him into their beds, using their own coercion as the justification for his lethal response. He was the mirror reflecting their ugliness back at them. Victoria believed she was the conqueror, stripping him of his dignity, but in reality, she was stepping into the vice. The soporific calm she described was the calm of the spider watching the fly struggle in the web. The irrefutable evidence was that the victims were the architects of their own demise, driven by a toxic blend of entitlement and lust. The impact of reading this diary on Hawthorne was devastating. He realized that the legal system could never prosecute this crime because the crime began with the victim's own violation of the moral and legal codes of the time. To read this diary in court would be to announce that the most respectable women in the county were committing rape and adultery with their chattel. The document was a grenade that would destroy the reputation of the entire white ruling class. Hawthorne understood then why the other husbands had sold Elijah so quickly. They must have found similar evidence, similar letters or diaries, chosen to bury the truth to save their family names. The diary also revealed the specific trigger for the final act. Victoria noted that on the morning of her death, she had slapped Elijah for spilling water, cutting his lip with her ring. "He did not flinch," she wrote. "He just looked at me. For the first time, he looked me directly in the eye. It was a look of such emptiness. I felt cold. That look was the death sentence. The pretense of submission had dropped. The game was over." She had crossed the line from owner to target, and the legs of ironwood closed that night. Hawthorne's analysis of the diary highlighted the symmetrical bruising mentioned in the autopsies. Victoria described his legs locking around her waist, his arms pinning hers. It was a position of total dominance and inversion of the slavery dynamic. He literally crushed the life out of her with the body she claimed to own. The symbolism was stark and horrifying, the object of desire becoming the instrument of annihilation. Upon finishing the diary, Hawthorne felt a sickness that had nothing to do with the winter chill. He held in his hands the proof that the silent breath was a monster created by the very people it destroyed. Elijah was a reaction of physical consequence of a system that tried to turn people into things. Victoria Beaumont had played with a loaded gun, believing it was a doll, and she had pulled the trigger on herself. The existence of this diary changed Hawthorne's mission. He could no longer view this as a medical mystery to be solved. It was a moral catastrophe to be witnessed. He hid the diary in his medical bag, knowing that if Mr. Beaumont saw it, he would burn it tanned, perhaps Hawthorne along with it. The irrefutable evidence demanded action. But, in a world built on lies, the truth was the most dangerous thing of all. The revelation of Victoria Beaumont's death, combined with the whispers spreading through the county, finally forced the hand of the Fairfax County elite. In early January 1836, a secret conclave was called a Committee of Public Safety comprised of the region's wealthiest planters, including the widowers Harrington, Montgomery, and Sinclair. The minutes of this meeting, kept in a sealed ledger that Hawthorne would later access through a sympathetic clerk, record the total collapse of moral and legal authority in the face of the crisis. These men who controlled the laws, the courts, and the militia found themselves paralyzed by the scandal they had nurtured. The transcript reveals a room thick with fear and denial. The men acknowledged in coded language the unnatural influence Elijah held over their households. They admitted, without saying the words, that their wives had been complicit. One entry quotes Captain Harrington, "We cannot hang him. To hang him is to admit why he was in the room, to admit why the door was locked from the inside. We cannot have that stain on our names." The law demanded a trial for murder, but the social code demanded silence. The authority of the white male patriarchy, usually absolute, was rendered impotent by the shame of their wives' infidelity. Instead of justice, the committee opted for a solution that was bureaucratic and cowardly. They declared Elijah to be incorrigible and mentally unstable, a danger, not because he was a murderer, but because he was bad luck. The decision was made to transfer him one final time not to another unsuspecting neighbor, but to the Whitaker plantation. Whitaker was known throughout Virginia as a breaker's yard or remote, brutal estate deep in the swamp, run by the sadistic Colonel Whitaker and his young, isolated wife, Sophia. It was a death sentence disguised as a sale. They intended for Elijah to be worked to death in the canebrakes, his body broken and buried in the mud, taking the secrets of Fairfax County with him. Hawthorne's own records from this time show his desperation. He tried to appeal to the sheriff, arguing that a serial killer was being moved, not stopped. The sheriff, a member of the committee, threatened Hawthorne with revocation of his medical license if he continued to spread libelous rumors. The institutions of justice had closed ranks. The collapse was total. The medical establishment, the legal system, and the church all conspired to protect the image of the plantation rather than the lives of future victims. They were willing to sacrifice Elijah to the swamp and risk Mrs. Whitaker's life, betting that the harsh conditions at Whitaker would neutralize the threat. The transfer of Elijah to Whitaker was executed under the cover of darkness. Hawthorne watched from his carriage as the man was loaded into a caged wagon. For the first time, Hawthorne saw Elijah clearly. He noted the man's stillness, the way he sat with his hands on his knees, staring straight ahead. There was no fear in his posture, only a terrifying patience. Hawthorne realized with a jolt that the committee had made a fatal error. They thought they were sending a slave to be broken. In reality, they were sending a wolf into a new fold. They were exporting the tragedy to the one place where no one would hear the screams. The collapse of authority also manifested in the disintegration of the families left behind. The minutes note that Captain Harrington had taken to drinking heavily and speaking to his dead wife's portrait. The Montgomery estate was falling into ruin as the master neglected the fields to hunt for witches among his workforce. The guilt of knowing they had allowed the killer to leave their homes alive simply to save face was eating them alive. They were men who claimed to be protectors of women, yet they had protected their own pride at the cost of justice. Hawthorne wrote a scathing entry in his journal. They call themselves masters, yet they are slaves to their own vanity. They have looked into the abyss of their households, wrought, and chosen to close their eyes. They believe sending the man away ends the story. They do not understand that he is not the cause. He is the symptom. And symptoms untreated only spread. The decision to send Elijah to Whitaker was the final act of a failed society. It was a bureaucratic shuffling of a human being that ignored the reality of what he had become. Elijah was no longer just a man. He was an inventive force of retribution that had learned it could act with impunity because the masters were too afraid of the truth to stop him. As the wagon disappeared into the tree line, headed for the dark, isolated expanse of Whitaker Plantation, the authorities congratulated themselves on solving the problem. They washed their hands of the blood, believing the silence would return. But Hawthorne knew the silence of the grave is different from the silence of peace. The ledger of the Committee of Silence stands as a testament to the cowardice of power, document that proves that when faced with a choice between truth and reputation, the Golden Crescent chose to let the burning continue. With Elijah moved to Whitaker and the official investigation stalled, Dr. Hawthorne felt the weight of the unresolved narrative pressing on him. He could not let the silent breath vanish into the swamp without understanding the origin of the pathology. His search led him to the dusty archives of a slave trader in Richmond, a man known for keeping meticulous records of premium stock. Posing as a buyer interested in Elijah's lineage for breeding purposes, Hawthorne gained access to the breeder's ledger, horrifying document that treated human genealogy with the cold calculation of livestock management. In the brittle pages of the ledger dating back to 1810 in Maryland, Hawthorne found the origin story of the monster. Elijah was not a random product of the system. He was a designed object. The entry for his birth listed his sire as a man selected for immense physical strength, and his dam as a woman, noted for her beauty and compliance. The margin notes written by the breeder were chilling. Subject bred for domestic service. Focus on symmetry and temperament. To be raised in the house. Condition for obedience. Elijah had been engineered to be the perfect object of desire and service-stripped of identity before he was even born. But the true revelation lay in a footnote added when Elijah was 10 years old. The entry recorded the death of his mother, damned deceased, suffocated by mistress, redacted in fit of jealousy. Subject witnessed event. Subject shows no emotion, retains value. Hawthorne stared at the words. The ink faded, but the horror fresh. Elijah had watched his mother being suffocated, likely with a pillow or by physical force, by a plantation mistress. The trauma was the seed. The method of execution was not an invention. It was a reenactment. He was visiting upon the mistresses the exact death that the mistress class had visited upon his mother. This discovery reframed the entire sequence of events. Elijah was not just avenging the immediate cruelty of a Victoria or an Amelia. He was closing a loop that began in his childhood. The soporific calm, the patience, the use of the body as a weapon, it was all a mirroring of the trauma he had absorbed. He had learned that the mistress has the power to take breath, and he had simply seized that power for himself. The exceptional bearing and gentle nature praised in the sales logs were the mask he had constructed to survive, a mask that hid a child still watching his mother die. Hawthorne also found a record of Elijah's younger brother, the one Victoria had threatened. The ledger showed that this brother had already been sold to the cane fields years ago, unbeknownst to Elijah. The threat Victoria used to coerce him was a lie. She was leveraging a person who was already gone. This realization likely shattered whatever restraint Elijah had left. He was fighting to protect a ghost. The cruelty of the deception added another layer to the tragedy. The entire structure of his compliance was built on a lie told by his tormentors. The hidden source exposed the generational nature of the violence. It wasn't just about 1835 Virginia. It was about the accumulated sins of the institution. Elijah was the physical manifestation of the memory of slavery, a memory that could not be erased, only repressed until it exploded. The breeder's cold assessment that the boy shows no emotion was the first documentation of the dissociation that would allow him to become the silent breath. He had learned to turn off his humanity because the world offered him none. Armed with this knowledge, Hawthorne understood the urgency of the situation at Whitaker. Mrs. Sophia Whitaker was not just another potential victim. She was the proxy for the woman who killed Elijah's mother. To Elijah, they were all the same face, the same force that took breath away. The specific identity of the woman didn't matter. The position of mistress was the target. The ledger proved that this was a war against a classist systematic extermination of the figurehead of the domestic plantation structure. Hawthorne copied the page from the ledger, his hand shaking. The dry commercial language, loss of asset, retained value contrasted violently with the blood debt it described. This was the root of the iron lover. He was not a beast. He was a mirrorand. The reflection he cast was one of absolute, suffocating justice. Hawthorne knew he had to reach Whitaker before the cycle completed itself again. He held the key to the psychology of the killer. But knowledge without action was just another form of complicity. The discovery of the breeder's ledger galvanized Dr. Hawthorne. He realized that observing and documenting the silent breath was no longer sufficient. He was the only man in Virginia who understood the mechanism of the threat looming over the Whitaker estate. His journal entries from late January 1836 shift from the passive voice of a narrator to the urgent tone of a participant. "I can no longer hide behind the shield of neutrality," he wrote. "To know the poison and withhold the antidote is to administer the dose myself. Mrs. Whitaker is alone with a force she cannot comprehend, and the committee has sealed her fate to save their pride." Hawthorne's decision to travel to Whitaker was made against the advice of his few remaining allies. The Whitaker plantation was located deep in the Ohoopee Swamp region, a day's hard ride through terrain that was treacherous even in good weather. Moreover, a massive autumnal storm was gathering off the coast, turning the sky a bruised purple and dropping the barometric pressure to a headache-inducing low. Hawthorne interpreted the storm as a pathetic fallacy, the atmosphere aligning with the violence to come. "The air is heavy," he noted. "It feels as though the sky itself is pressing down, mimicking the hands of the killer." His justification for the journey was rooted in a desperate hope that he could cure the situation by exposing the truth. He believed that if he could confront Elijah not with chains, but with the knowledge of his past, with the name of his mother, he might break the trance of vengeance. It was a naive humanist hope, born of his medical training, that sought to heal rather than destroy. He packed his medical bag not with instruments of autopsy this time, but with sedatives and the ledger page. He intended to speak to Sophia Whittaker to warn her, to strip away the veil of ignorance that made her vulnerable. The journey was a nightmare, documented in Hawthorne's travelogue. The road was a ribbon of mud winding through cypresses' knees and hanging moss that looked like skeletal fingers in the gloom. The storm broke halfway through his ride, turning the world into a gray wash of rain and wind. His carriage threw a wheel, forcing him to continue on horseback, soaked to the bone. The physical struggle mirrored his internal turmoil. He was racing against a timeline he couldn't see, driven by the haunting image of the wooden bird and the bruised ribs. As he neared the Whittaker estate, Hawthorne encountered a group of slaves fleeing the property. They were terrified not of the overseers, but of the house itself. They told him in frantic shouts that the big house had gone quiet, that the master was away in town, and that the Iron Man was inside with the mistress. They spoke of a heavy sleep falling over the grounds, the same soporific atmosphere Hawthorne had noted in his case files. The terror in their eyes confirmed that the final act had already begun. Hawthorne pushed his horse to the limit, the animal's hooves churning the sucking mud. He wrote in his mind the speech he would give, the plea for sanity he would make. But deep down, the source material, the ledger, the diaries, the autopsies told him that words were useless against a force this entrenched. Elijah was not operating on logic. He was operating on the physics of trauma. An object in motion stays in motion until acted upon by an equal and opposite force. Hawthorne feared he was not that force. The decision to intervene was Hawthorne's final attempt to impose order on chaos. It was the act of a man who believed that truth could save lives. But as the silhouette of Whittaker Manor rose against the lightning-streaked sky, dark and silent as a tomb, Hawthorne felt the cold certainty that he was arriving not as a savior, but as a witness to the funeral pyre. The decision to act was noble, but in the inventory of breath, nobility carried no weight. Only air mattered, and the air at Whittaker was already running out. Dr. Hawthorne arrived at the Whittaker plantation. Just as the storm intensified, the lightning illuminating a scene that would be etched into his memory forever. The main house was not silent as he had feared. It was roaring. Flames licked from the upper windows, casting a hellish glow on the wet Spanish moss. But the fire was not the primary source of horror. That lay on the front lawn, untouched by the flames, arranged with a chilling, tender precision. It was the body of Sophia Whittaker. She was laid out on the grass, her hands folded over her chest, her dress smoothed down. Hawthorne dismounted and ran to her, checking for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. Her face bore the same expression as Amelia Harrington and Victoria Beaumont look of wide-eyed, transfixed calm. There were no burns on her skin, no soot in her nostrils. She had not died of smoke inhalation. She had been suffocated before the fire was set. The silent breath had claimed her in the sanctity of her room. And then, in a final act of ritual, the killer had carried her out of the inferno he created, preserving his work while destroying the cage. Hawthorne looked up from the body and saw him. Standing at the edge of the tree line, where the manicured lawn gave way to the wild swamp, was Elijah. The light from the burning house flickered across his face, revealing the exceptional beauty described in the ledgers, now hardened into something statuesque and terrifying. He was not running. He was not hiding. He stood perfectly still, watching the house, the symbol of his oppression, turn to ash. For a moment, the two men locked eyes across the divide of race, history, and violence. Hawthorne, the man of science, and Elijah, the man of silence. In that exchange, Hawthorne saw no madness, no hysterical fit. He saw absolute clarity. Elijah raised his right hand slowly to his own neck. He did not wave, did not point, simply wrapped his fingers around his own throat in a mimicking gesture of suffocation, held it for a heartbeat, and then released it. It was a message. I have taken the breath. The debt is paid. Then, with the fluid grace that had captivated so many women, Elijah turned and walked into the darkness of the swamp. He did not look back. He vanished into the miasma, returning to the primitive, lawless world that the plantation owners feared so much. He left Hawthorne with the corpse, the fire, and the realization that the law could never touch him now. He had become part of the landscape, a ghost story that would haunt the Golden Crescent forever. Hawthorne's interpretation of this final tableau written in his journal by the light of the burning mansion was stark. He burned the house to erase the record, Hawthorne wrote. But he saved the body to leave a message. He wanted us to know that it was not the fire that killed her, it was him. He wanted credit for the silence. The fire was the cleansing. The suffocation was the justice. By carrying Mrs. Whitaker out, Elijah had demonstrated the ultimate control. He could take life and he could preserve the vessel, proving that the ownership had truly been inverted. The destruction of the Whitaker estate was total. The records, the whips, the chains all consumed. Only the body remained as the final primary source. Hawthorne realized that Elijah had not just escaped. He had transcended. He'd executed the final mistress and destroyed the stage of his suffering. As the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, Hawthorne understood that the inventory of breath was closed. The account was settled. The aftermath of the Whitaker fire was a masterclass in historical revisionism. The official report filed by the Committee of Public Safety stated that the Whitaker estate had been destroyed by a lightning strike during the storm. Mrs. Sophia Whitaker was listed as having perished from smoke inhalation, a lie that preserved her dignity and concealed the bruising on her ribs. Elijah was listed in the county inventory as lost property, perished in fire, bureaucratic erasure that denied him both his crime and his escape. However, the unofficial consequences were immediate and profound. A wave of terror known locally as the Great Quiet swept through the plantations of Fairfax County. The sickness that had claimed 14 wives suddenly stopped. There were no more mysterious cases of apoplexy, but the behavior of the aristocracy changed permanently. Diaries from 1836 onward describe a new austerity. The women stopped receiving male servants in their private quarters. The doors were bolted with new, heavier locks. The boudoir ceased to be a place of leisure and became a bunker. The legacy of Elijah lived on in the whispers of the enslaved community. He became a folk legend, the iron lover, or the breath thief, a spirit who could walk through walls and take the air from the lungs of the wicked. Nursemaids used his name to frighten cruel children. Elders whispered it to give hope to the broken. He became a symbol of the one thing the masters could not control, the terrifying possibility that the tools of oppression could be turned back on the oppressor. Dr. Hawthorne left Virginia a month after the fire. He could no longer breathe the air of the Golden Crescent. He returned to Boston, where he burned his manuscript of the case, fearing that publishing it would only bring infamy to the victims rather than justice. He kept only his private journals, hidden in a locked box. His career never recovered. He was haunted by the faces of the women and the final gaze of the man in the firelight. He spent the rest of his life studying asphyxia, obsessed with the mechanics of breath, trying to understand the physics of the silence he had witnessed. The Whitaker plantation was never rebuilt. The land was allowed to return to the swamp, the ruins standing as a blackened scar on the landscape. The local population avoided the area, claiming the ground was sour. It became a dead zone where the magnolia refused to bloom. The cover-up was successful in the short term. The scandal was contained, but the fear it engendered rotted the society from within. The confidence of the Golden Crescent was shattered. They knew, even if they wouldn't admit it, that their power was fragile, held together by nothing more than the breath in their lungs, which could be stolen in the night. In the end, the legacy of the silent breath was not in the lives taken, but in the fear instilled. Elijah had proved that the walls of the big house were not impenetrable. He had turned the domestic sanctuary into a killing floor. The 14 death certificates remained in the county archivi, silent testament to a serial revenge that history tried to forget, but which memory refused to release. Decades later, in 1918, an archaeological survey of the Ohoopee Swamp Edge, miles from the ruins of the Whitaker estate, uncovered a peculiar find. Embedded in the root system of a massive ancient cypress tree was a human skeleton. The bones were bleached and scattered, reclaimed by the earth. But entangled in the rib cage of the skeleton was a gold locket tarnished black by time. When cleaned, the inscription on the back was found to read, "Ah, forever." It was the locket of Amelia Harrington, the first victim. The discovery presents a final haunting paradox. If this was Elijah, why did he have the locket? Was it a trophy, a token of love, or was the skeleton not Elijah at all, but someone else? The forensic analysis of the bones revealed one anomaly. The femurs were exceptionally thick and dense. The legs of iron that Lydia had described, but the skull showed no trauma. He had died presumably of natural causes, living out his life in the freedom of the deep swamp, carrying the token of the woman who started the cycle. This tangible evidence challenges the official narrative of the fire. Elijah survived. He lived. He carried the weight of his crimes, or his justice, until the earth took him back. The story of the silent breath is not just a horror story. It is a tragedy of a society that cannibalized itself. The women were victims of Elijah, yes, but they were also victims of the lie they lived. They died because they believed they could own another human being's body without consequence. Dr. Hawthorne's journals, finally discovered in a Boston attic in the 1940s, provide the voice for the voiceless. They tell us that history is not just what is written in the victory logs, but what is whispered in the gaps. The mystery of the 14 wives is solved, but the moral question remains unresolved. Did Elijah find peace in the swamp, or did the breath of the 14 women haunt him in the silence of the trees? And more terrifyingly, how many other natural deaths in the ledgers of history were actually the work of silent avengers whose stories were burned along with the plantations? The inventory of breath is closed, but the ledger of sin remains open. If this dive into history's shadows left you questioning everything, smash that like button, subscribe for more gripping tales of the forgotten past, and hit the bell to never miss an upload. Drop a comment. Was the breath stealer a ruthless murderer or a twisted form of justice? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation alive. Until next time, stay curious and watch your back.